All right, we'll begin now. Hello, everyone. And because we are discussing China, Dajahao, I am Pranay Kotasthane. I head research programs at the Takshashila Institution. I welcome all of you on behalf of both Takshashila and Hudson Institute. And before we begin, just a bit about the two institutions for those who might be new here. So Takshashila Institution is a center for research and education in public policy, physically located in Bangalore, but operating around the world since 2010 over the internet. And as an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank, we are engaged in discussing India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed, and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. On the other side of this collaboration, we have Hudson Institute, founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn. Hudson Institute international relations, economics, healthcare, technology, culture, and law. Now, coming to this discussion series. The aim of these conversations is to answer one central question: how India can and respond to China's increasing assertiveness and growing global ambitions. So that's what the theme of all these webinars will be. And as this each of us particular action is something that we call a deep webinar, which is thoughtfully curated conversations that bring together great panelists and interesting discussions. So ordinarily when we have distinguished panelists, Ambassador Nirupama Menon and Ambassador Husain Haqqani. Just not that they need any introduction, but I'll just introduce them very briefly. Ambassador Nirupama Menon has served as India's ambassador to both the US and China and as India's foreign secretary. And joining her is Ambassador Husain Haqqani, director for South and Central Asia at Hudson Institute, who has also served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States. Welcome to both of you. And joining them are three discussants: Hamsini Hariharan, Yenching scholar and host of States of Anarchy podcast; Shreya Upadhyay, a geopolitical research analyst; and Akshay Alladi, alumnus of Takshashila's GCPP program. So we will get started now. The way we are going to do this is we are going to get started with a few questions, and then we'll bring the audience in. We have a few polls lined up for you, and we'll take questions from the discussants as well. So in today's topic, we want to explore the future of the global order and China's role in shaping it. Over the last few years, this term changing global order has been used a lot. And in fact, in the last 10 years, I sort shift in this with a global recession and probably a secular stagnation in the next few years. Economic nationalism and creating alternatives to China in the supply chains seems to be sort of a growing trend across countries. On the other hand, geopolitically, the confrontation and competition between the US and China seems to be increasing. And COVID-19 itself, although has led to reduction in the power and legitimacy of both US and China, arguably, some middle powers probably may enjoy more bargaining power with them as a result, while some others might be losing out. So that's what we want to discuss today. And let me start with this question to both our panelists. First to Ambassador Rao. So at the intersection of these political and economic trends, we have world order scenarios, right? So in the geopolitical and geoeconomic terms, how do you see China's position changing over the next 5 or 10 years? Ambassador Rao?
Thank you, Pranay, and thanks to Takshashila and Hudson for organizing this webinar. I look forward to participating in it. In answer to your question, Pranay, I think we must prepare ourselves for disruption and disequilibrium as Chinese power and influence seeks to maintain a growth trajectory that is greater than that of the United States, and as the latter seeks to oppose this trajectory of China's growth through various stratagems. Of course, a lot depends on the internal course that China takes, the health of its economy, for example, and the question of leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping and what destiny wills for him is the hinge factor. If his authoritarianism is further entrenched, then the closing of China and the narrowness of perspectives in dealing both with questions of internal stability through strict and unyielding control and zero tolerance of dissent, as also with exercising Chinese nationalistic zeal abroad, will be more and more in evidence. The situation regarding Taiwan is also going to be of particular concern. It's quite likely that the future looks particularly bleak for Taiwan, and that the counterproductive use of force by China to resolve the question of reunification with Taiwan looms on the horizon. The United States, on the other hand, will be called upon to react, and the continuance of America's leadership position in the region would be severely compromised if the US stood aside and allowed Taiwan to be gobbled up by China. It's therefore presumed that there will be a countering move from the United States to resist Chinese military action to take over Taiwan. Predictably, Chinese zeal to reunify Taiwan through military force is not going to resonate well at all across the region, and only intensify antipathy and mistrust against China, stretching from Japan to India. Are we seeing the growth of Chinese empire? Although to China's wolf warrior diplomats who mainly gear their rhetoric to please a domestic audience, the term may be distasteful. No country in the world is going to believe Chinese tales of victimhood or the talk of a century of humiliation. The Americans also forswear any application of the term empire to their own selves. But these two gargantuan states have a power reach that recall the girth, the spread, and the power of empires. We in India, with our experience of another empire in our recent pre-independence history, should know that too well. The bipolarity between China and the United States that is threatening to create a chaotic global future recalls a struggle between two large empires for global dominance. Is American great power chauvinism encountering its Chinese doppelganger, as Chas Freeman said recently? Can the next 10 years see the gradual replacement of unbridled rivalry and tension between these two by more dynamic forms of cooperation? One can only hope, coexisting with competition that keeps the peace and a greater opening of minds. Countries in the region may favor a great power balance between the US and China with more room for maneuver rather than getting smothered under the weight and tension of great power competition. Strategic autonomy is not a discredited concept. It has its uses and it does become a survival technique. Power and influence, on the other hand, in the next decade will be built on the anvil of technology. The United States is obsessed today about the challenge that China poses in technology and military power. Various actions have been taken by the US government and it is fully supported. These are fully supported across the bipartisan divide in Congress to pressure and cut off access to Chinese tech firms in this regard. Huawei leads the pack. Bipolarity in this regard is going to splinter the world. How is the disruption going to be dealt with? Will geopolitics trump globalization? This is a rivalry that can truly turn the world upside down. And we need solutions that protect vital interests while at the same time finding reasonable solutions that promote connectivity rather than divisions. I'm reminded of the words of the Canadian Sri Lankan author Michael Ondaatje, and he says, "I no longer guess the future and do not know how we end nor where," unquote. Therefore, will multilateralism be abandoned to the hegemony of the powerful? How can we abandon it? China may well seek to be the new champion of multilateralism as the United States wrestles with its own misgivings and grievances about the course taken by global institutions that it sees have diminished the American interest. The post-pandemic world is seen by many as a world where there is a power vacuum, a leadership deficit. And China is bound to push its concepts of a, quote, community of a shared future for mankind, unquote, in this scenario. Smaller countries, including those in our region, will be quite open for bidding and not unwilling to slip into the sphere of Chinese influence. They will be quite multidextrous in an entropic world, beset by a geopolitical version of PTSD. Now, will China be interested in exporting its ideology, that of the CCP, to the outside world? Perhaps not as an export of revolution, as in the Mao era, but it fancies a world built on its ideational definition of order, progress, hierarchy, and stability. And it will seek to enable such a matrix, especially in countries, the smaller, powerless ones, that border its periphery. There it will build patron-client relationships, and it will seek to arbiter politics and ensure the strict protection of its interests. Democratic politics, press freedom, opposition voices, all these will not be regarded as valid or consequential. Deference will be demanded even if there is no conquest envisaged. Again, the picture of empire comes to mind. Perhaps the need to understand China has never been more acute, especially in India, where it looks like we are reversing such a need in an expression of our antagonism and mistrust after Galwan. Know thine enemy, as they say. We ignore China at our peril, not to supplicate, but to occupy for ourselves a more vantage position in addressing the China challenge. These are a few of my thoughts, Pranay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Now over to Ambassador Haqqani. How do you see China's position changing over the next 5-10 years in the global order? Ambassador Haqqani, you're on mute.
I guess that is probably the most used sentence in the world these days. You are on mute, please unmute. Let me begin by saying that Ambassador Rao very succinctly explained and outlined the questions that we face. Therefore, I'm not going to repeat the points that she has already made. I am just going to try and point towards what I think will be the differences in the next few years from the last few years in case of China's rise. We must understand that the world actually facilitated China's rise by assuming that China's rise will be peaceful and that it will be non-threatening. It was a Chinese narrative and everybody bought into it. The United States, for example, never thought of China as a rival until recently. In the process, the Chinese were able to engage in trade practices that did not conform to the global order. They virtually undermined it, all to their advantage. They engaged in technology theft, because there is no other word for it, by disregarding all kinds of intellectual property concepts. And in case of military technology, quite aggressively engaged in espionage and theft of American technology. Now, all of that, I think, in the next few years is going to change. Not because the Chinese will stop, but because the rest of the world has decided that their assumption about China's peaceful rise was erroneous, that while we wish and want China to rise peacefully, that's not the direction China is taking under President Xi. And therefore, there will be less opportunities for China to continue exploiting the advantages of globalization while not ceding space on elements of globalization that would have required China to give. So China has been in a taking position for several years without necessarily having to give concomitantly. In the US, I think that there is consensus, as Ambassador Rao rightly pointed out, that things cannot continue the way they are. Now, we can see that as a established power or the previous global power trying to stop the rising power, but I don't think it's that simple. I think what it is a moment of awareness. It's an awareness that while the Chinese acted as if they were non-threatening to everybody, they were actually playing the long game. Even India has had a moment of great awareness based on what they have done along its border. It's very interesting that there are a lot of people in India who always seen China and understood that China could be threatening in the future, and yet they were caught unaware when it actually happened. The United States now, I think, is moving in a direction of understanding that it has to do something to ensure that China does not have all the cards in its hands. So what we are seeing, I think, is a limiting of China's trade practices. There is definitely a move to try and see if the WTO can actually apply its own rules to China, and if not, then maybe China should no longer be part of the WTO. We are also seeing an American willingness to really crack down on the illicit transfers of technology from China. Now, China's rise has involved actually becoming the global manufacturing hub. And yes, China is very integrated into global supply chains, but that's because everybody thought that this is a great opportunity of being able to buy cheap goods manufactured by cheap labor in a country with plenty of labor. If China does not have the advantage of global market access as it has had in the last many years, I think that China will find it difficult to sustain its stupendous rates of economic growth. We are already seeing some problems there, but people say that those are attributable to COVID. But I think that the post-COVID recovery will not be as easy for China as some think. After all, they have a large population to cater for. They have to deal with the rising expectations of their own populace. And they will not have the advantages of being able to dump manufactured goods at low prices the way they have done in the past. In the military arena, we must understand that whatever people say about the decline of the United States has not declined as the world's largest military power. It still remains a major military player in the world, in fact, the largest, significantly larger and stronger than everybody. Can the United States use that military power without actually provoking war? That will be the big question for the next decade. Can China be made to change its ways without actual deployment of force by the United States? I think among the other things that the United States is looking at is how China's Belt and Road Initiative actually is not about global connectivity, but about global dominance, based on the idea that whoever controls the connection will also dominate and hegemonize the outcome. The United States is talking about sort of new initiatives in the Arctic, the South Pacific, and Africa, and also in space. So will all of these become arenas of conflict and contention, or will they result in some kind of a new negotiated global order is what we have to watch out for. What are the options for other players? Well, I think that there was an expectation for a very long time that India, without losing its strategic autonomy, will, for its own interests, play a more active role in the Indo-Pacific in maintaining the region's freedom of navigation, but also of making sure that the democracies work in concert. There is now some concern that India's reluctance to play that role may actually result in the other powers like the United States, Japan, Australia, having to act in a way in which they can lure India into playing the role that people see India as the one that India should be playing. So we will see a little bit of, shall we say, a little shadow play on that score as well. The potential anti-China concert trying to lure India insisting on its strategic autonomy in a way in which it deals with China, but does deal with it on America's terms. And that will be another thing that we will see emerging in the next decade. I think that that the expectation that economic growth will lead to China becoming more tolerant, more open, a more democratic, possibly, society, those hopes have been dashed. And I think nobody is going to carry those illusions into the next decade. It's not just about President Xi. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very coherent force, has gone along with President Xi and his authoritarianism. And so the era of collective leadership, of a light foot, treading lightly, that is over. And that will now result in people reconsidering, various countries reconsidering their policies. The holdout so far in looking at China as a potential source of disorder rather than order on the global scale are the East Asian countries. The ASEAN countries would still like to resolve this without making China feel that China is being singled out. That could have its advantages. They could be good intermediaries. They could be the ones to persuade China that we are not necessarily the ones who are scared of you anymore, but the rest of the world is. So kindly try and change your behavior. But I don't think that that is likely in the immediate future. And so we need to brace ourselves for more moves on the strategic chessboard by the United States and China, and a realignment of the world in which the old concept of globalization, of it'll benefit everyone, and if somebody violates the rules and the understandings that it is predicated on, that's a minor matter. I think that attitude will change. We will see the rise of nationalism everywhere, but that rise of nationalism, I think, will have to be subsumed in the global order or disorder rather than being denied. I think that is what is ahead of us, a China that is not viewed as a benign power as it has been for many years.
Thank you, both of you. So now I want to bring the audience into the conversation here. Aditya, could we release the poll? We have a question on what do you folks think about how China is going to operate in this emerging order. Aditya, could we have that up? Yeah. So you would see a poll on your screens and you can take that poll, answer it, and we will post the results of that in a moment. Before that, I want to go to the next question now. Ambassador Rao, so given that we are heading towards a bipolar order, and that is what seems most likely, So what do you think should India's response be given the situation that we are in now? Ambassador Rao, you're on mute.
Pranay, to answer your question, assuming that we see a fragmentation of the world economy and localization of politics, so if technology and trade wars between China and the US are set to intensify, obviously we are going to see fragmentation. And in such a scenario, China is going to prepare to exercise its own hegemony over large portions of the developing world, especially where Western influence and liberal democratic ideas have less currency. Of course, this cannot apply to India, but we are going to be confronted with a situation where China's so-called discourse power is going to increase in direct proportion to whatever it sees as Westlessness, the lack of presence of the West. And they'll be talking about win-win cooperation, the Chinese, and sitting tight, as the proverb goes, in their fishing boat, determined to ride out the storm. Now, if we have to look beyond bipolarity, we have to obviously take into account that there will be scattered groups of countries and coalitions of the like-minded, which constitute our region or sub-region. So there's already talk of a D10 or group of democratic countries that link the G7 with India, Australia, South Korea in what are called trusted networks. And the issue of access to strategic resources critical for manufacturing in a fourth industrial revolution is going to be vital, as also the creation of alternate supply chains. Now, if the technology war intensifies, what strategies are there to fill the gap and meet the need? That's what we need to devise. For instance, can India, Japan, and Germany form a technology coalition that combines our strengths in data processing and know-how with the R&D and financial strengths of the other two? Plurilateralism could be the new normal. East and West will become meaningless constructs. And will we see a tightening of cultural norms and methods of governance going by the experience of which countries fought the coronavirus better as we move forward in the future? So the post-pandemic world for India may not be kinder and nicer, but nastier and far more brutish, inward-looking and not more inclusive. And for India, of course, it means a far more unstable global environment. So this is going to be a world without real global leadership in a bipolar configuration. So we will have to hedge and look out for our best interests. And current global trends already point to this instability. Anti-globalization is another strengthening force. Keeping foreigners and outsiders out is another. Industrial and supply chains being broken, that's another scenario. And there's also going to be a fall in American prestige, particularly centered around the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic. So China benefits from this, and the power gap gets reduced between the two. Now, there are going to be doubts in Asia about the durability of US leadership. And I think the US needs to support countries in the region rather than commandeer, rather than seek for them to take sides in its dispute with China, because a US-led approach could box countries into a corner with China. And we need a stronger intra-Asian coordination, and that requires the US to compromise. And I think for India, it will involve creating whatever it may mean, however much the tensions with China have boiled over after Galwan, we still have to think how we can craft a multi-dimensional modus vivendi together with other countries in the region with China. Ambassador Haqqani mentioned ASEAN. Now, ASEAN really wants to retain its maneuverability between both the US and China. It would like the economic linkages with China to go on, and at the same time retain the military security advantages it gets from relations with the United States. So we are really today existing in a rather complex situation, And our own, the challenges that we face in the bilateral construct with China are pretty serious and quite stark today. And it will involve a great deal of introspection, not only about the course we took in our relationship with China over the last 30 years, but it will also involve very, very difficult and calculated and well-deliberated decisions when it comes to how we chart a course forward for the future in dealing with the challenge from China, but at the same time understanding that we need stability in this relationship because there are so many unfinished tasks as far as we are concerned in terms of making India a leading global power.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. Aditya, could we have the results of the poll, please? Okay, so this was the question posed: how will China take its place in the world order? And yeah, overwhelmingly 77% people say by remaking the order to suit itself. So yeah, quite a confrontationist position is what most people here think. All right, let's go to the last question that I have before handing it over to the discussants. Ambassador Haqqani, how do you think US will respond, or how do you think US should respond given the challenge?
Well, what I say that should be the U.S. response is not going to determine the U.S. response. So I'm going to just talk about how I see them responding. Look, one of the things we have to acknowledge is that there's the old saying, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. I think that there is a corollary to that, and that is that the fight of the elephants does not actually take into account what happens to the grass. So that has to, what we are now, I mean, I understand that everybody wants to be able to have greater maneuverability, but at the end of the day, ASEAN, for example, will have to decide, how far are they willing to forego the benefits of the security advantages of having a close relationship with the United States in case China becomes more militarily assertive. Similarly, yes, it is the desire of India to have complete autonomy and not lose the advantages it has, for example, in the form of trade, etc., with China. It's not in India's interest to become more confrontational and create a rivalry with China of its own that will be disadvantageous to it. But it also has to take into account the fact that the interest of China in South Asia enables the smaller powers of South Asia, which would otherwise accept or would have to accept India's natural leadership. It gives them a bit of option. And so we have Nepal acting up, we have Sri Lanka, Pakistan always sees it in its advantage to try and box in India. Things could go wrong in Bangladesh. So all of that actually requires a greater attention to what is coming, which is an American decision of a strategic nature that business with China will not continue as before, that China is a peer rival or potential rival, that America's advantage right now will diminish over time. And so therefore, whatever America wants to do has to be done now. That will essentially mean greater pressure on countries, third countries, to try and to choose sides. And while it may not be what we deem to be right, I think that's where American policy is headed. The Americans are actively trying to see if they can line up countries as potential allies. Americans always look at the world in terms of allies and non-allies. This is very different from, say, for example, the Indian approach, where we want to see, or the South Asian approach, where everybody wants to see partners. And so, we can trade with you, but we don't have to be part of your other things, etc., etc. Why can't we just all be sort of have a mutually beneficial relationship? It's very it was a problem during the Cold War in US-India relationship. It worked out well for India at the end, but but the Americans were always wary of Indian non-alignment. I think we are headed for a similar questioning of the reluctance of India to be a more assertive actor in the potential containment of China. Now, there will be other issues. We will see a lot of changes in American policy on trade. It will be gradual because America doesn't want to hurt its own corporate sector, but it's happening. It's already starting to happen, and it will become more more pronounced as time goes by. The same goes on the question of technology. Will there be new coalitions, for example, in terms of dealing with the technology issues? Absolutely. Most countries would like to have autonomy, and so therefore the China, therefore the Japan, Germany, India coalition is perfectly possible. But we must also remember that we live in a very capitalistic world, and in the end, it'll all come down to who can have the economic advantage in it as well. That is, and I don't think it is going to be easily or simply a bipolar order. Because China doesn't have the kind of massive military power at this moment, except manpower. In terms of military technologies, they are not necessarily anywhere close to the United States or the willingness to spend on it. They will spend on it and they will build the capacity. They will also try to build the capacity of their allies. Question is, can America spare the money? And is there an interest? Because America is also divided. We have a very strong neo-isolationist streak in America that we notice, where people say, do we really need to be sort of engaged? We have two oceans protecting us. As long as it's not a direct military threat to us, why do we really need to commit troops around the world? So that interplay within America will also determine how far America is able to move in counter-checking China's assertiveness. And then how an assertive China acts. Ambassador Rao rightly mentioned Taiwan as a flashpoint. America and Taiwan have an agreement. It's part of their joint security agreement. Will that draw the US in? Does China want to do that? And if it doesn't, then how does it manage its internal rhetoric with its outward potential and capability? Those things, I think, will be determining factors in the next few years. I think we will have slightly greater clarity after November. A Trump victory will basically mean that the 6 or 7 points that I mentioned as the points of pressure that the Trump administration has figured out, they will actually be applied. Now, we must remember that that while the doctrine of containment had been mentioned, the actual security strategy was never made public by the Truman administration way back in 1948 about what they exactly are going to do. The same applies now, but I think a strategic document has obviously been created, and that does say what are the exact things America will be doing to check the influence of China. So in case of the Trump administration, we will have a little bit more of both rhetoric and strategic moves. In case of a Biden administration, I think that there will be less noise, but more action, and we will see where that takes us.
Thank you. So sort of competition and confrontation are likely to stay regardless of the administration?
Competition, definitely. Confrontation, not necessarily in the immediate future, but again, a lot depends. Look, all confrontations depend on moves by both sides. So it's not like America wants to confront China. America would not confront China if China was not acting the way it has been.
Right.
And the same goes for India. I mean, why would India want to confront China? Why would it want to upset its own economic progress by creating conflict? It's not about wanting conflict or confrontation. But sometimes confrontation comes to your doorstep, not because you want it, but because the other side makes a move that creates confrontation.
Right.
China usually moves in very insidious ways. It actually, because Chinese take pride in this whole notion of the long game, uh, which which is not always easy for democracies to play, because in democracies, in 5 years or 10 years or 8 years, governments change. The Chinese can actually sort of look at what they've done in case of Pakistan. I mean, yes, everybody saw Pakistan and China as very close, but did anyone realize that the Chinese will insinuate themselves into Pakistan's political and military and intelligence decision making as deeply as they have done? I mean, I am these days doing a test of my own with everyone, whether it's American or non-American, and I ask them the question, do you really know how many Pakistani students there are in China right now? And you won't believe it, including senior Indian officials, no one is able to answer it correctly. The maximum someone has ever said is 40,000 students. The truth is 110,000 Pakistani students study in China right now. China is really looking forward to a longer term game in which it will use Pakistan as a secondary actor and a secondary deterrent, a bit like North Korea has been useful in checking South Korea and Japan. Keep them occupied with their regional players so that they can't play a more global role. That kind of strategy, long-term thinking, is not always easy in a country like the United States, where every 4 or 8 years the government changes, and therefore every new person tries to tweak or change the strategic strategic doctrine and strategic actions. So we will have to see what China does and how the responses are measured. But yes, competition definitely, confrontation possibly.
Thank you. So I'll now go to our discussants. Hamsini, you have a question or a comment, please go ahead.
Thanks, Pranay. Thank you, Ambassador Haqqani. Thank you, Ambassador Rao, for your very insightful comments. I have a question for the both of you. Now, we know that China has the 2 centenary goals. One that is up next year, which is to commemorate the founding of the Communist Party of China, where it hopes to become a moderately prosperous society. And one much in the future, in 2049, to mark the founding of the PRC. And as Ambassador Haqqani said, we know that China is playing the long game, or is projecting that it is playing a long game. So knowing that they have set these 2 centenary goals for themselves, what should India and the US be cognizant of? What should they be doing? What should they not be doing?
Ambassador Rao?
I think in response to Hamsini's question, that we are already confronting the here and now of Chinese overreach in our region, in the Indo-Pacific. And you know, China has obviously already suffered severe reputational damage by its actions. We see it all around us. And countries like India and the United States, not only because they are strategic partners, not only because we are democracies, not only because we look at the world differently, we have had actually palpable experience of dealing with China and understanding the nature of Chinese aggression, the type of Chinese expansionism that looms across the horizon. And what is even more worrisome is this unwillingness to acknowledge that there is the concept of any original sin as far as China is concerned. I mean, you look at the way they talk about the confrontation that they've had with India across the line of actual control. They're constantly emphasizing that the rights and wrongs of what happened should be clearly known, and they are, you know, thereby suggesting that all the wrongs lie with India and all the rights lie with, all the rights lie with China. So this is the China that we are dealing with, and as Ambassador Haqqani mentioned, with the United States, it has become the death of engagement with China, much before the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, or the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. So I think the time for judging China and assessing the kind of strategies that we need to apply to China's rise or China's so-called rejuvenation are already, the time is now really to make those assessments. We don't need to wait for the next decade or the next decade and a half. And the world is being impacted, I think, by all those actions. Take the BRI, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative. The whole trajectory of the BRI is going to determine, not only the division of the spoils as far as, the future of the world is concerned, but also how that is going to impact on the well-being of countries, their debt financing, their freedom in the future, their sovereignty, their independence. All those questions perhaps do not trouble some of our smaller neighbors. I mean, Pakistan, for instance, takes decisions perhaps always with an eye on how it is going to impact India and what kind of effect it will have on India. But when you look at the way China has acted in, I think agnosticism would be a kind word. It has been totally unprincipled, I think, when it comes to applying issues like the fight against terrorism, for instance, in our neighborhood. It is concerned about terrorism in Xinjiang. It is concerned about separatism in Tibet, but it is not concerned about these matters when it comes to the manner in which these trends affect India. So this in itself is an object lesson, I think, for the world when it comes to assessing China's capacity to act with responsibility as a global power. I don't believe, not only does China not have the discourse power, as some people have mentioned, but also the capacity to prove that it can act responsibly, that it can be a peacemaker, that it can bridge divides, that it can, overcome this agnosticism when it comes to issues that really affect human destiny and well-being and developmental prospects and stability, political stability all across our region. And that's what, so China tends to act totally, Edward Luttwak refers to the fact that China suffers from great power autism. This complete inability to, or at least seeming inability to sense the rights and wrongs of how the actions it takes impacts the countries and people around it. So just to briefly answer your question.
If I may come in for just a quick second to answer Hamsini's question, it's very simple. The anniversaries are from the Chinese point of view. They're for China. They're not for the rest of the world. The fact of the matter is that China had played a good game in terms of convincing everybody that its goals were not what its goals were. And I think that that curtain has been pulled down, and now people can see that China is not the peaceful rising. All we are doing is we are a developing country that's trying to make life better for our people. All we are trying to do is help. It's very obvious that many of the BRI projects actually have military relevance. They are not economic projects. We already saw, for example, that the port of Hambantota was not an economic project because it wasn't economically viable. Otherwise, ships would have come into Hambantota. The port of Gwadar hasn't seen any. Pakistan has 2 ports that already are operating below capacity. Building a 3rd port didn't make sense, but they did. And all of this is essentially for a longer term future plan of using these as military ports. And so anybody who doesn't want to believe it just because China is celebrating the anniversary of this or that, I don't think that they live in the real world.
All right. For the audience, there is another poll that Aditya has put up. So please answer that and I'll just put the results of it soon. But now going to Akshay. Akshay, do you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, thanks, Pranay. I have a comment followed by a question. Ambassador Haqqani and Ambassador Rao, you laid out very clearly what India and the US should do or will do to respond to a growing China. My question is really the flip side of that, which is what they should not do. Or given the fact that the United States is a country in relative decline, and there's a sense of imperial overstretch, so to speak, and imperial exhaustion, which are the parts of the world, so to speak, where they should pull back and deprioritize so that they can focus their resources on the Indo-Pacific and on China in particular. And equivalently, even with India, given the big power asymmetry that we have with China, and the fact that we have a continental challenge, not just a maritime one, and no formal treaty alliance with the United States. Again, what should India do differently, Ambassador Rao, in its own neighborhood, so that we are able to devote sufficient resources to meet the challenge of China?
Can I request Ambassador Haqqani first on the US side and then come to Ambassador Rao?
Well, I think that's more appropriately a question for Ambassador Rao. For the simple reason that India will do what it deems in its best interest and should do that. So I think that others suggesting what India should do, there's been enough of that already in the world. But I think that
I was referring to the US, Ambassador Haqqani. What is likely that US shouldn't do or wouldn't do in order to invest more resources towards China?
Well, I think that basically the free run that China has had in terms of access to both the market as well as the technology of the United States, I think that that free run has ended, but has to end even further. Secondly, I think that the United States needs to understand that not everybody wants to be a military ally. This is not going to be like NATO. There's no need to try and create a new NATO-like structure for the Indo-Pacific, but that it can actually have partners, each of whom with some degree of autonomy will be able to act together. It may be a difficult sell because Americans think a certain way and it's not easy. Lastly, I think America should help build the capabilities of regional powers in Asia and enable them to be able to feel at least comfortable in standing up to any challenges that China might present.
Ambassador Rao?
Yeah, in terms of what India should do, I think at this moment, of course, our concentration is on how to diffuse the situation that we face across the line of actual control with China. I am not sure about how much ground we have covered. Obviously, the government knows this best and is keeping its cards close to its chest because there's very little information that has been divulged in the public sphere. But there are a few, of course, journalists who keep close tabs on this. And I would assume that from the Chinese side, there has been very little give on restoration of the status quo ante prior to, the events at Galwan. So the entire line of actual control, particularly in the Western sector, and who knows whether China will try to, bring alive other pockets of difference in other sectors along the India-China border, we don't know. But so the question of high preparedness for India, I think would be a national priority. We also have to think of the kind of strategies we need to put in place on the economic and business front vis-a-vis China. Whatever steps that we have taken, of course, have in a sense been done also to assuage the levels of public concern and public antagonism vis-a-vis China, which obviously no democratically elected government can afford to ignore. To what extent this will induce a change in Chinese behavior, I do not know, but this is a time really for India to craft perhaps a strategy to cover the next 3 to 5 years on how we are to reduce dependence on China, how we can reduce China's capacity to coerce, to use coercive diplomacy on the economic or trade front. I don't believe China will be able to do much vis-a-vis India as far as that is concerned. But then turning to our neighborhood, we talk of our neighborhood first policy. I believe this is really the time to make the right deductions from all that has happened so far, and to see how we can put in place corrective moves to reduce some of the trust and confidence deficit with our neighbors. I mean, I'm leaving aside Pakistan for the moment, but neighbors like Nepal, Bangladesh, for instance, I think there is much work to be done on that front. I'm sure a lot of the bad vibes that have been generated in recent months can be reduced if India were to make the first move, and if India were to be more generous and more if India's outreach could acquire more substance and content. And I'm sure India can do it, because ultimately South Asia and the idea of South Asia itself is based on the foundational value that we are an integer, that we are meant to be integrated. We should have more connectivity, not only as far as infrastructure is concerned, but where trade and economics are concerned, and where people-to-people connectivity is concerned. I think all that has been, in a sense, not received the attention that it has deserved in recent years, and we need to make amends on that front. I think there is no harm in being as ambitious as possible when it comes to these matters, and building stronger partnerships in the region, so that the strategic landscape in which China has become a very, very, visible operator can be, in a sense, recast more to conform to not only our interests, but also reciprocally the interests of our neighbors.
Thank you. So I'll go over to Shreya. Shreya, you have a comment or a question?
Yes, thank you, Pranay.
Shreya, before you start, just a reminder, we just have 4 minutes left. And
I'll be very, very brief.
Poll results as well. Shreya, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. So I'll be very, very brief with my comment. Now we've, Ambassador Haqqani and Ambassador Rao have talked at length of the BRI initiative. And how it was aimed at a globalized world and so-called sustainable developments, but there's been a weakened confidence in that entire initiative. However, still BRI is being touted as a COVID-19 Marshall Plan, which can lead to global revival from the COVID-19 recession. And it's a great soft power tool in the absence of any soft power initiatives, smart power initiatives by other countries. So in this regard, and this question is for the both of you, what role do you think that India and not just India, in fact, other powers, Japan, Australia, the Quad and the Quad Plus can play in furthering soft power in a very multilateral or a regional way? And again, what steps can India take to reclaim its traditional sphere of influence that it has lost? Something that Ambassador Rao did point out. But yeah, your comments on that.
Ambassador Rao?
Yeah, well, as far as the BRI is concerned, I'm not sure it's a glorious soft power kind of rainbow that China is trying to create in the region. For one, of course, China is not exactly showering the recipients with great generosity. Much of the infrastructure that surrounds the BRI is being built on Chinese lines of credit rather than grants that are being given to these countries. Chinese labor is being used for the construction of most BRI projects. So it's essentially, I think one of our China scholars in India, for instance, referring to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, called it some kind of a self-sustaining Potemkin loop. It kind of just goes around and heads back to China, literally. It helps China. So this is essentially a Sino-centric view of the world that is being created through BRI, all roads leading to Beijing, as it were. So I don't believe we can use, the description of this becoming a symbol of Chinese beneficence or munificence as far as the rest of the world is concerned. And I think more and more, as debt financing becomes an issue, you've seen what happened with Hambantota Port and, debt being converted into equity, the lease being given to China for 99 years. And this is going to happen. I mean, the kind of debt burdens that are being placed on some countries, Sri Lanka being one of them. And I heard that Vanuatu is another country that has also suffered a similar situation. So it'll be interesting to see in the time span you spoke of in the next 5 to 10 years, what the effects of the BRI are going to be. Is it just a grandiose, scheme that the Chinese Emperor Xi Jinping has devised in order to articulate China's so-called greatness abroad, or whether it will just be, just a disaster that history is going to be quite frank in judging China about the fact that it didn't succeed in the way it was intended to.
Ambassador Haqqani, any ending comments?
I would say that I have just 2 quick comments in response to comments that have been made or questions that have been made on the Q&A, written Q&A by Nitin Pai. He said that democracies too can play the long-term game, and I agree with him. But for that, what is necessary is for democratic leaders not to think only in terms of short-term political gains at home. What we have at the moment are a lot of populist leaders who want to only do what is useful for them in a very narrow domestic context. So that's where democracies then become less able to play the long-term game than authoritarian regimes. Otherwise, democracies definitely can play the long-term game, and we've seen that in history. And the second point he makes is, which is interesting, that China does not have strategic geniuses. They're not as great as people say, because after all, they have picked fights with all their neighbors, and that's not a great strategic advantage. And I agree with that only in part. The strategic failing of somebody is a strategic failing only if somebody else can take advantage of it. And so the question is, are the democracies able to take advantage of China's inability to carry a large number of countries with them? Right now, for example, they have annoyed and offended many more nations than they have been able to befriend. And that is an opportunity for everybody else, the democracies, to actually get together and deal with. And lastly, I think Ambassador Rao's very valid point about BRI. BRI could end up being a gigantic failure in the sense of having ports that are not necessarily being used, of infrastructure that is not essentially as productive as it was expected to, and it becomes a major environmental disaster for the world as well. But before we get there, maybe there is room to try and stop it and get more and more countries to sign on the idea that BRI is not what it is made out to be.
Thank you. And so it looks like China has picked up a fight with the US too early, but contrast that with, for example, this poll result as well, where a lot of people, 47% still feel that after COVID-19, China's relative power with respect to US has increased. So I think the role of discourse power that China has deployed or has been able to deploy has some role to play here. So with that, I think I'll end this conversation. Thank you to all our panelists, discussants, and all of you for joining in. And we will have another conversation next week, same time, and it will be on a different topic, but on the same theme of how to counter the China challenge. Thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you, Pranay. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Pranay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.